Hey, Mike.
Hey, Sarah.
Sorry, my computer's being a really pain in the butt right now, but we're getting there.
Okay.
Alright, so I just need to do this.
So should I have Facebook open too?
You don't have to. If you want to, you can, and then you can follow along with the chat.
Okay. Where the chat will be obvious. I'll figure it out. Don't worry.
Yeah, if you just go onto our Facebook page, we're live now. So hello and welcome to people. We're just getting ready to go here. So we'll just see. We've gone live. Let's just got 70 people on. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm gonna be helping to host tonight. I'm Sarah, and Mike is here as well. So we're just gonna let a few more people join in. Looks like we're up to 85. If you want to say hi in the comments, please do so. Hello, Justin Paul Kinney. See, we've got you. You're here and set up. So Mike is here tonight. He's going to be doing our presentation for us. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We will be taking questions, and we're going to ask if you can hold your questions until the end. Just from a technology point of view, Mike pre-recorded his presentation. We're just going to say this right out front so that we didn't lose our internet connection. So there wouldn't be any jumpiness in this. The nice part about this is that we'll be able to have access to the files right away. So if you weren't able to see it here, we will put it up on the OFO YouTube page as well. All right, we're seeing lots of people coming in and saying hi. This is Justin Paul's son, Joel, and he's 8 and loves birding. Well, welcome, Joel. Hopefully you're going to learn lots about winter birding in Ontario. So we've got 139 people on already, Mike, so I think we should probably get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Mike Burrell to you tonight. I met Mike at Peely, and Mike's been birding with his family, and I really feel a connection with Mike because of that, because I've also birded with my family for my entire life. So Mike's passion for birds is amazing, and he is such a great ambassador to the birding community. He is always there to answer eBird questions if you've got one, and if he can't answer it, he always knows who to send you to. You may know that Mike and his brother wrote a fantastic book about birding in Ontario, so he's going to be pulling on all of those experiences tonight and sharing his passion for birding in Ontario in the winter with us. So, Mike, do you have a couple words to say before we get the video rolling?
No, thanks everybody for joining. It's really exciting to get to do this. So I hope you all enjoy it, and we'll have lots of time for questions, I think, at the end. So.
All right. So I'm going to switch over to the presentation mode now and just make sure we've got everything set up nicely there. Just hide that other video. All right. So we are going, I have so many windows open on my computer right now. There we go. So without further ado, we'll start.
And I hope that you're all able to enjoy the presentation. So I'm going to be talking about winter birding in Ontario, and I hope by the end of tonight I'll have convinced you all that if you're an Ontario resident, that you need to do nothing else except stay here for the rest of the winter and winters in the future, because the birding here is so awesome. And if you're joining us from outside of the province, I hope I convince you that at some point in the future, you need to come and spend some time birding here in Ontario, because we've got everything you could want. So my outline today, I'm going to be telling you why winter birding is so awesome. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges of winter birding and a few tips and tricks. But the focus of my presentation is really about some target species and target destinations for winter birding. And I focused the talk on Southern Ontario. Northern Ontario is a whole other presentation, but also amazing and a place we should all be birding at as much as possible in the winter because it's so much fun. But focusing on Southern Ontario tonight. All right, and then I'll of course have time for some questions at the end. So when you think of winter in Ontario, this you can be forgiven if this is what comes to mind. It can be pretty snowy, it can be pretty cold, and it's easy to just want to curl up by a fire and stay inside. But there's so much more to winter than just the snow and cold. It is a pretty beautiful place when we've got this nice fresh snow, and not just scenery, but the birding is pretty awesome. It's the time of year when some of our coolest birds show up. A personal favorite of mine is the northern shrike, and we really don't get to see these any other time of the year. So we get some pretty sweet birds like shrikes, and everybody goes nuts for owls, of course, and snowy owls. What's not to like about them? They're huge. They're awesome predators. They're sort of mysterious. They're nomadic, and they look cool. So we get some pretty kick-ass birds in the winter. And for me, one of the things I love about winter is getting to feed birds, running bird feeders and sitting inside and watching birds, but seeing what comes. You get to enjoy seeing stuff up close, right out your door, if you're out your window, if you're lucky enough to have feeders like that. But it gives people a chance to study birds up close that you wouldn't necessarily get to see otherwise. I particularly have a fondness for watching juncos and looking at how each individual junco is a little bit different. And with the feeder birds in the winter come some rarities, and we can always count on one or two varied thrushes at a feeder somewhere in Ontario. So we get some pretty cool, sort of unusual things showing up at bird feeders. And the great thing about these sort of stakeout rarities in the wintertime is they usually stay put for the entire winter. So when a varied thrush shows up in mid-December, it's probably still going to be there in February. So the extended stay means lots of people get to enjoy these birds. And a lot of you may recognize this one from Bark Lake last winter. Now the stakeout and the rarities aren't just feeder birds. Some pretty spectacular things like harlequin ducks are also regular sort of rarities in Southern Ontario in the winter. And ducks in general really are pretty awesome part of winter birding in Ontario. This is probably one of the most common birds you could find in Southern Ontario in winter, mallard. But if you stop and look at them, they are pretty spectacular. And the cool thing about ducks in winter is this is when they're at their brightest. The males are trying to court females in the middle of the winter and pair up before they head north in the spring. So it's a nice bonus of winter is that the ducks are visible and at their brightest. And another great aspect of birding in winter in Ontario are the winter hawks and owls. This is a light, more rough-legged hawk, and this is definitely one of my favorite species that I associate with winter in Ontario, where I grew up just outside of Waterloo in the sort of Linwood area. We've got a lot of agricultural fields and big concentrations of rough-legged hawks. And it's one of these things that I think Ontario birders take for granted, that you can go out and see a dozen or 2 dozen rough-legged hawks pretty easily, and not many other people in the world can do that easily. So it's pretty cool to get to see these Arctic breeding hawks come down. And in Southern Ontario, we even have a few red-shouldered hawks as well. And this particular individual is one of my favorite individual birds that I've ever seen. This one showed up near my parents' house out, in a little town called Hawksville, and we found it in the December of 2003, and it came back every single winter for 11 winters. So we got to know it pretty well, and got to know its different patterns, and it was pretty cool part of winter for a decade to be able to go and see this bird. And it's not just hawks. The other big predator birds that you get to see in winter are owls. They become more conspicuous. If you're lucky, like I was about 10 years ago, you might even get them to come in and hunt the small mammals that are attracted to your bird seed, like this barred owl was. So there's a lot of reasons to like birding in the winter, and the birds obviously are a big part of that. Now, it's not without its challenges. It can be pretty cold. It can be pretty snowy. So you've got to deal with those challenges. The picture on the right of the screen there is my road a couple of winters ago after a big snowfall. So you do have to worry about getting around for sure, and being prepared for driving in the winter is one of the big challenges. I remember one winter about 10 years ago, a couple of birders were coming to meet my brother Ken and I. They were going to pick us up at like 7 a.m, and then we were going to drive up to Algonquin Park. And we were wondering where they are. Where are they? They hadn't arrived yet. And then finally we got a phone call, and they had managed to put their car partially into a ditch going around a turn. Luckily, it wasn't too bad, but we had to figure out where they were. I remember they weren't exactly sure where they were, but we found them in the dark, and Ken and I came and helped them push the car out of the ditch. And then the rest of that birding trip was pretty successful. And another fun, I guess as fun as it can be with minor accidents, but I remember taking a couple friends from southwestern United States. They were in Toronto for the year, and they really wanted to see some snowy owls. So I was taking them out looking for snowy owls, and we came across somebody who had slid partially off the road, in a rural part of southwestern Ontario. And so we got out of our car and helped push the vehicle back on the road. And the guys from New Mexico and California, when they got home, when we got back to the house, we of course had seen a couple snowy owls too, and they just thought that was the most Canadian experience they could ever have had, getting to see snowy owls, rough-legged hawks, and helping push somebody out of a ditch. So you can make those situations into not such bad situations sometimes. So as far as tips for birding in the winter, one of the best things is to make sure you're prepared with your gear. So make sure you dress warmly, dress in layers, and your vehicle. You need to be prepared with your vehicle. But it's really important to pay attention to the habitat, and I guess that's really no different than in the summertime. But in the winter, it's still very important. You want to focus, especially if you're looking for songbirds in like forested areas or in edges of fields and stuff. You really want to pay attention to habitat. Look for real sheltered areas. In this picture, we were doing the Kitchener Christmas bird count, and it's this little secret spot that we know of where we get into this little creek valley, and it's surrounded by really dense cedars and spruce trees on each side. So it's got a lot of real important features that can attract, especially lingering species. So it's got the creek stays open because it's moving, so open water. There's a whole lot of berry bushes in this valley as well, so there's abundant food source, and the conifers and the valley itself provide really good shelter. So those are all real important features for finding areas where you might have more songbirds than more exposed areas. And another feature of this area is it gets a lot of sun first thing in the morning, And often if you can find a spot like that on a real cold, clear, sunny winter morning, find a spot with some shelter, but that gets the early morning sun. And if you keep an eye on those areas, you'll often find owls and hawks and other birds just sort of sitting on the edge of the bush, soaking up that little bit of sun. Another big tip is you really gotta work sometimes in the winter to find birds. There definitely are fewer birds around than in the spring or the summer and the fall, and so you've got to do as much as you can to bring them out and see what's around. So always be looking for chickadees. A lot of other birds will travel with chickadees. If you hear a chickadee, stop and make sure you do lots of fishing to try to get the chickadees and any other birds that are around, get them to come out. So lots of fishing. And if you're in an area where there's lots of people, like a park or something like that, often chickadees will come right into your hand if you've got some seeds. So always be looking for chickadees is a pretty important point when doing winter birding in Ontario. Another thing to keep in mind is that roadsides can be really good, especially after a fresh snowfall. After a fresh snowfall, you'll often get birds come into the road where the snow might have been cleared off by snowplows already. That's what this flock of eastern meadowlarks is doing. This was down on Lake Erie one winter a few years ago, and you can see they're kind of concentrated along the edge of the road there. But even with a snowfall, you'll often get a push of birds into feeders and things like that. So pay attention to the weather as well. And I kind of mentioned it already with the open water, but open water can't be understated how important it is, especially for ducks, believe it or not. If you wanted to look for ducks, you got to find open water, and of course, if you're doing ducks, scope's really helpful because they're sometimes further away. So those are a few tips, and I want to move on now to talk about some of my favorite winter birding destinations in the province. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Algonquin, and before I say too much more about Algonquin, I just want to say I'm going to do about 4 or 5 locations, and so I can't cover the whole province, obviously. And there's lots of other great places for birds in winter that I'm not going to mention today. And if you're wondering why I didn't mention your favorite spot, it's because I wanted to keep it a secret so nobody else comes to it. So just want to get that out of the way. And okay, so let's talk about Algonquin. So Algonquin Park is definitely one of our most famous winter birding destinations. The park itself is huge. It's almost 8,000 square kilometers. Most of that, though, is pretty inaccessible, especially in the wintertime. There's only really the only road that really goes through the park is Highway 60, and the map that we're seeing is the Highway 60 corridor. But that's still about 60 kilometers. So it's a big area. Now there's 2 main things that people are going to Algonquin for in the winter: winter finches, and then the Algonquin Specialties. And I'll talk about those in a second. But I want to just focus while we're on the map on sort of the main areas that I like to bird when I'm birding in Algonquin in the winter. So I usually start at the West Gate. So I usually work west to east. So the Western Uplands Backpacking Trail is at kilometer marker 3. And it's, as you can see, it's a huge trail. So don't try to hike it, at least not the whole thing. When I'm birding here in the winter, I just stop in the parking lot. There's some conifers right behind the parking lot that can have interesting birds. But there's also, if you start walking the trail, the first sort of 500 meters to kilometer, go through some really good spruce forest. And it can be a great spot to find the Algonquin Specialties, but also for winter finches. So that's an easy spot to stop. And it's one that a lot of people ignore, unfortunately. Okay, so if you keep moving down Highway 60, you'll get to the Mizzy Lake Trail, and you can hike the whole trail. It's about 10 kilometers. But some years the Arrowhan Road is plowed, and if the road is being plowed in the winter, and it's safe to do so, then you can drive up, and there's an old railway bed, and the top part of the Mizzy Lake Trail actually follows the old railway bed. So you can park at the intersection with the railway bed, and some years you can even drive down the railway bed. If you can do that, then the top end of Mizzy Lake Trail can be quite good for all the sort of regular winter stuff that you're looking for. Otherwise, you'll have to do the hike or just bird along the Arrowhan Road. All right, now you keep moving further east. Mule Lake Campgrounds open year-round. There will be campers there all winter. So if you can go in there, some of them often have bird feeders that they're maintaining. And if there are, then there will certainly be more birds here than you'll see elsewhere in the park. Algonquin's really unique because it's all this sort of natural landscape, and it's not like the rest of southern Ontario where there's houses and cities and people everywhere. So the birds that are in Algonquin Park really are acting like birds are supposed to, and not eating sort of human foods. So that they're sort of concentrated in places where there are human supplemented food sources, like Mule Lake Campground. But the area is also good for, in particular, Canada jay, especially when there's feeders going. You should be able to get Canada jay in there, and sometimes black-backed woodpecker and all the finches are possible there as well. Okay, further east is the Spruce Bog Boardwalk, and this is a short trail. It's only about 1 kilometer. And this is like, if you only have time for one thing, Spruce Bog Boardwalk is probably the place to go. Right at the parking lot, you often get Canada jays right in the parking lot, and then you have a good shot at basically all the Algonquin Specialties by walking the trail, and the finches flying over. And the visitor center is pretty much across the highway from the boardwalk, and the driveway itself is good for finches. And then there's feeders at the visitor center, which are a must-stop place in the wintertime to get some finches. Now, the last place to try is Opiongo Road. And again, in some years, the road will not be plowed, so you won't be able to drive up. If it is, it's often plowed up to a gate kind of halfway up, so you can park there. The best area I find for winter birding in Algonquin on Opiongo Road is from about the gate up about 1 kilometer. So if you can concentrate on that area, it's probably best. So I already mentioned sort of the targets for most birders in Algonquin in winter are finches and the Algonquin Specialties. So I've got a pair of red crossbills here. I photographed these last winter along the visitor center driveway. And the finch numbers really vary from year to year, depending on food sort of availability across North America. So some years there's a lot, and there can be a lot of all the different species of finches. Last winter was one of those years where pretty much everything was around in good numbers. This year is looking like it probably won't be very good in Algonquin for finches. But the good news is that's because most of them have come south. So you might not have to go very far to get your finches this winter. But red crossbills and white-winged crossbills, the two species, they don't really come into the feeders. Instead, you're more likely to get them, like I did, on the driveway or along the road, picking up salt and sand, or feeding up in conifers. Now, the feeders, as I said, are a must-visit spot. This is the visitor center feeders, or one of them, and you can see I've got a flock of evening grosbeaks here. There's basically always evening grosbeaks, even in poor finch years. There's usually some evening grosbeaks in Algonquin, and if they're anywhere in the park, they'll be at the visitor center. But in a decent year for pine grosbeaks, there should be pine grosbeaks here, and same with if there's red poles pine siskins, they'll be in at the visitor center feeders hopefully too. Now the Algonquin specialties I mentioned, or I kept mentioning, include Canada jay, and if you bring some granola bars or something with you, you'll get them to come in and feed from your hand, and you'll be able to notice most of the Canada jays along Highway 60 are color banded like this one as part of a long-term study of their populations in the park. Now, Canada jay is pretty much the easiest of the specialties. Blackback woodpeckers, definitely harder, but I think easier than the next two. The trick with blackback woodpeckers is to listen for them flaking bark. That's their typical feeding mechanism. They flake little bits of bark off and then look for insect larvae underneath. So you can hear that sort of tapping and flaking from quite far away if it's calm out. So those are the best days to listen for blackback woodpeckers. And then once you hear a woodpecker, try to track it down, which can be pretty challenging. Sometimes if you take a step off of the packed down trail, you fall down, waist deep in snow. So keep that in mind before you start running off the trail trying to track down a woodpecker. Now the Algonquin specialty I find the most frustrating to locate is spruce grouse, because they'll spend a lot of time just sitting very still, sometimes up fairly high up in a tree. Sometimes they're feeding up in the tree. Other times they're walking around on the ground, but they don't make a whole lot of noise in the winter. The most likely noise you'll hear is the sound of their wings as they're flying up or down. So you just got to be patient. Spruce Bog Boardwalk's a good spot to find them. Sometimes you got to walk that trail like 10 times, but hopefully you'll get one when you're looking. Now the last Algonquin specialty to mention is the boreal chickadee. These guys have become much harder in the last few years. They may be declining because of climate change, and it might be a species we completely lose from the park eventually. But there are still some in the park. Spruce Bog's a good spot, and Opiongo Road is another good spot. The trick for these is to find chickadee flocks, especially in areas with lots of black spruce, and do lots of pitching and listen for their more nasal calls. And if you hear them, then try to track them down in the flock. Often, though, I find boreal chickadees are a little shyer than the blackcaps when they're in a flock like that. And sometimes you'll get a flock of chickadees, and if you do, pay attention to the ones that are kind of hanging back on the edge of the flock. And those ones sometimes turn out to be boreal chickadees. All right, so we're going to move south into Ontario's Banana Belt, the north shore of Lake Erie. And I'm not talking about a very specific spot to bird here, more just sort of a general area and strategy and things to look for. This is a really fun place, I think, for birding in the winter. It's really underbirded. There's not a whole lot of people that live down here, especially close to the lake shore. But it seems like most birders don't spend much time down here, even though it's not too far from London, Hamilton, and Kitchener-Waterloo. Most people don't venture down here for some reason, but because it's so much further south than the rest of the province and slightly warmer winter temperatures, you get a lot more of the lingering migrants down here, like sparrows and yellow-rumped warblers and hermit thrushes. So it's definitely a favorite place for my family and I to go down and go birding in the winter. We like to cruise the roads, especially after a heavy snowfall, like I mentioned earlier. Watch the roadside flocks. There'll be huge flocks of tree sparrows and juncos. So drive slowly and scan through them. You'll find, song sparrows and swamp sparrows are pretty regular, but things like Savannah sparrow, you have a good shot at finding. And once in a while, if you're really lucky, you'll find something like this, a Vesper sparrow. So there's always goodies to find down along Lake Erie if you put the effort in. And while you're birding down there, keep an eye up because there are golden eagles that spend the winter now down in southwestern Ontario, especially. They cover a big area every day, or they can. So you got to be lucky to see it just as it happens to go over. But they're around for sure, and it's possible they're actually hunting wild turkeys now in southern Ontario. Now, it's not just the lingering land birds along Lake Erie that are worth going down for. Lingering water birds, as long as there's open water, you'll have some water birds that stick around down there. And you can get pretty impressive flocks of Santo Cranes now, especially around Long Point. They regularly have a flock of 1,500 or 2,000 cranes lingering well into December. And in warm winters like last year, there was hundreds, pretty much all year, all winter, that stuck around. So definitely keep an eye out for cranes and other lingering water birds. All right, so at the east end of Lake Erie, the lake drains into the Niagara River. And this is another one of our real famous winter birding spots. Most of you Ontario birders have probably been to the Niagara River and Niagara Falls for winter birding. The attraction, of course, is the falls itself. But the whole river gets incredible numbers of gulls. The three big ones are herring gull, Bonaparte's gull, and ring-billed gull. All three of them occur in globally significant numbers, which is why the Niagara River is designated as a globally significant important bird and biodiversity area. And it's pretty impressive to go down there and see tens of thousands of gulls swirling around the river. But of course, all the birders there are looking through these more common species, looking for especially the white-winged gulls like Iceland gull and glaucous gull. Those are two that you're pretty likely to turn one or two up in the winter. Now the peak times for the gulls, especially for numbers, is early December, late November, early December. If you are going back later in the winter, you'll see much fewer gulls, but you can actually find pretty decent numbers of these white-winged gulls, really more so later in the winter. And basically any of these spots, with the exception of Algonquin that I'm mentioning today, if you find gull flocks, you got to look through them to try to find these goodies. Now, the river is not just awesome for gulls; it's really good for water birds in general. I always associate common loons with the Niagara River in winter, so keep an eye out for loons and other water birds like ducks and swans. And if you're walking around on any of the trails in the sort of forested areas along the river, you're quite likely to come across tufted titmouse, which this is about the most common, the place in the province where they're the most common. All right, we're coming out of the river, and we're going to go to the west end of Lake Ontario now. And again, this is a big area. I'm not going to talk about specific locations. Basically, you can stop anywhere along the lakefront in the west end of Lake Ontario, and you're going to see a lot of ducks. Now, there's lots of other real cool birds to see in the winter in this part of the province. But the claim to fame is the big duck concentrations. And this area is actually also identified as a globally significant important bird and biodiversity area. Now, the most abundant species of duck that you're going to find is long-tailed duck. There's counts up to 200,000 long-tailed ducks within the area. It's not uncommon to pick a random point, especially sort of the Stony Creek portion of the area, it's not uncommon to go out and walk out to the edge of the water and put your binoculars up and see 10,000 long-tailed ducks swirling about. It's pretty spectacular. So you're not going to miss long-tailed duck, that's for sure. But there's really nowhere else that you're going to see numbers like this. So it's pretty amazing. And I think it's definitely something that Ontario birders take for granted, the huge duck concentrations that we're treated to every winter. In with the longtails are good numbers of white-winged scoters like this one. But you can get all three scoters pretty easily in the winter in the area. And this one, like a lot of the ducks this time of year, are feasting on zebra mussels. And it's really important. Birders are always staring through flocks of scoters because they're trying to turn up more unusual species like king eiders. And when king eiders show up, there's usually a few every winter. They're virtually always in flocks of scoters. Not always, but that's your best bet, is to sort through the flocks of scoters with the hope of finding a king eider. There's usually one or two Barrow's goldeneye and harlequin ducks as well to reward the patient searchers. So there's good reason to be searching through these flocks of ducks to look for the more rare species. As you're driving from spot to spot or walking from spot to spot, you're also in one of the best places in the province for northern mockingbirds. So keep an eye, especially in places where there's lots of berry bushes or berry trees. Okay, the final location that I want to talk about is another very famous winter birding destination in Ontario. It's called Amherst Island, and Amherst is just west of Kingston, about half an hour west of Kingston, and to add to the excitement, you have to take a ferry to get there, which in my books automatically makes it one of the coolest places you can go to. So you grab the ferry in Millhaven, and then it's only about a 20-minute ferry ride. It's not very long. Now Amherst is a really awesome birding spot all year round, and Ontario birders, I think most of them don't realize how good it is outside of the winter. Most of them come here in the winter, but unfortunately never get a chance to come birding here in the rest of the year. But in the winter, it is at its probably at its best. It certainly got the most sought after species in the wintertime. And what people are coming for are hawks and owls, especially. And you can see on the map, the little inset map near the east part of the island. That is the Owl Woods, which is it's a little woodlot made up of jack pines and spruce trees, and it's a spot where some winters, like a couple dozen owls of 3 or 4 or 5 species even could be found. And on the island as a whole, the number of owls and hawks can be pretty incredible. It really varies from year to year. It depends on how many small mammals there are around, so how much food there is. And the good news for everybody listening tonight is it sounds like it's a really good year for meadow voles on the island. So I guess that depends on your perspective. If you're a meadow vole, it's not a good year because probably it means there's a lot of hawks and owls that are going to be showing up. But that's good news for us. Anyways, the birding strategy on the island, I always go basically straight to the Owl Woods. And the road that you access Owl Woods off of, Marshall 40-foot road, it's become really degraded in recent years. So you're most likely not going to be able to drive that road unless you've got some sort of souped up 4x4. So you're most likely going to have to park at one end of the road and then walk up. It's about a 15 or 20 minute walk, and it gets pretty hard in some years when there's deep snow to walk through. It can be pretty tough. The woods itself, it's only about a 5 or 10 minute walk to follow the trail from the parking area, which of course that's if you can drive there. But from that parking spot, you walk through some hardwoods and then lots of patches of cedars, and then you get into the plantation, and that's only about a 5 or 10 minute walk. So it's not a big area to search, but you can spend a few hours walking through. The area you want to focus on is the plantation, and that's the best way to do that is just walk real slow and look at every tree, every conifer in there. You look at right up against the trunk. That's usually where owls are roosting, but you have to be very thorough. And it's very common for people to go in as a small group, 2 or 3 people, and the first 2 people look intently at a tree, and then the third person happens to notice there was an owl sitting there. So it's tricky, but it's well worth the effort. So the owls that are in the owl woods itself are usually sitting like this. This is a northern saw-whet owl, and they're usually right along the trunk. And I find the saw-whets are usually fairly low, kind of like 5 feet to 10 feet up in the tree. But this is the sort of search image you're looking for. In a sort of average to good year, there'd be 3 or 4 saw-whets. Maybe 2 to 4 saw-whets in an average to good year in the woods. So I mean, you can imagine trying to find basically a robin-sized bird sitting very still that's camouflaged. You're not guaranteed to see one, that's for sure. In really good years, there's you might find a boreal owl or 2. The most I've ever seen in the woods is 2, but that was a pretty good year. I don't think there's been a boreal owl for a few years in the owl woods, so you do have to get lucky. And then the other owl that one of the other owls you might find in the owl woods is long-eared owl. And in some years in the past, there's been 10 or 20 long-eared owls, and they're usually in groups, sort of roosting communally. And they often, I find, are roosting higher up in the trees than the saw-whet owls and the boreal owls. So those are the 3 main ones. The fourth is barred owl. I didn't put in a picture, but you might come across a barred owl roosting in the woods. Now the rest of the island is really good too. You can do the rest by car, and one of the birds that a lot of people are going to look for by car are short-eared owls. This photo's got 2 short-eared sitting on the post, and there's a little blurry thing in the back there. That's actually a northern harrier. So you can get lots of hawks and owls hunting the farm fields. The short-eareds tend to favor fields that have sort of the long, weedy fields, long grass, weedy fields. And sometimes they're out hunting during the day, and sometimes they're out sitting like this. But often I find you have to wait pretty well till dark. I remember one time I was on Wolf Island, which is just one island over basically, looking for short-eared owls with my dad. And we didn't see a single short-eared owl all day. Then we missed the ferry that we were planning on taking. And so we were sort of stuck waiting for an hour for the next ferry to come along. So we drove around in the dark, and we found like 10 or 15 short-eared owls just with the headlights of the car. So it's worth staying right till dark, especially if you haven't seen any yet. Now, the other owl that you're likely to find in the open fields are snowy owls. And they're well known because a lot of people think of them as hunting during the day. They do hunt during the day sometimes, but they spend most of the day sitting, usually on the ground or on a small perch, like on the top of a hay bale here. It's often you can drive around the island and only see one or none. And then as dusk approaches, all of a sudden you start seeing snowy owls everywhere. And those have just been ones sitting on the ground roosting for the day, and then they're starting to get active as it's starting to get dark. So they hunt during the day, but they also mainly hunt at dusk and even at night. So be aware of that. And this is one to keep an eye out for as you're coming across on the ferry. Especially if there's ice, you'll sometimes see snowies sitting on the ice. And you can sometimes see 2 or 3 just coming across. And along with the hawks and owls that you're likely to see on the island in good small mammal years, you can also find decent numbers of northern shrikes, which, as I said earlier, is one of my favorite winter birds for sure. So keep an eye out for them on hydro wires and tops of little trees and shrubs as you're driving around. So I hope I've convinced you that winter birding's where it's at. There's some pretty amazing birds to see in Ontario in the winter, and we're really lucky. We've got a ton of absolutely world-class birding sites that we can get to easily and enjoy some pretty spectacular birds. So that's it for the presentation. Thanks very much. Does anybody have any questions?
All right, we're back, Mike. Thank you, Mike. That was a great presentation. We do have a couple questions that I figure we can answer now while we're waiting for more questions to come.
Hi there, I'm Michelle the Painter from Berkshire Paint and Sip, and this is Paint and Sip at Home.
There we go. Sorry, we had something else just invade us there. So we had somebody asking about red-shouldered and rough-legged hawks in the Hamilton area. And if there was any good recommendations as to where to look for them there.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so red-shouldered hawk is kind of a funny one in Ontario. They're sort of present in the sort of Toronto to London and south area in really low density, and sort of the further south in the province you go, the more likely you are to find them. There's usually a few around the Hamilton area. But I mean, they're kind of hit or miss. So it's hard to tell you where to go specifically for one because there's only a few around in any given year. But I mean, you can just come across one. They hunt from perches. So I've seen them right on Highway 6, just outside of Hamilton. And there's been one the last few winters that you can actually see from the 401. If you can picture the service center just east of Cambridge, if you look real closely in the trees and any perches between, basically from that service center west to the first road that goes over the 401, there's been one in that general area for the last few years. Now rough-legged hawks are a little easier to point you to. They're more reliable in close to Hamilton. If you head down towards like the Cayuga area and cruise back roads, the roughlegs really like the big open fields more so than red-tailed hawks. The other area within sort of an easy drive of Hamilton to see good numbers of roughlegs is if you go west and north of Waterloo and get into the flat open fields.
Yeah. So we had somebody who was asking kind of about how realistic is it to do this kind of birding in winter if we don't live very close by, thinking about COVID. And I think it's a good point. You should try and stick as close to home as possible at this time. This just is a perfect segue to introduce something we're going to be doing for OFO this winter. As many people may or may not know, you can keep a winter bird list starting December 1st to February the 28th. And we're going to be doing another OFO Winter Birding Challenge this year. So similar to the Birding at Home Challenge in the spring, we're going to challenge you to go out there and see as many birds as you can. And we're really encouraging people to do it within a 5-mile radius of their own homes. So I think this is going to be a winter where a lot of people can kind of explore a little bit closer to home, and you might be really surprised as to what you can find. I'm lucky. I have a pretty good 5-mile birding radius around my place. So, because it includes Point Pelee. So I'm lucky from that context, but still, where I grew up in Sarnia, that kind of radius near my home in Sarnia, you would be amazed at the amount of things that you could find at this time of year. All right, so we also have a question about what is the best strategy for finding winter finches this year, Mike?
for the best strategy for finding winter finches this year, it might be to stick around in your backyard. Basically, all the winter finches have moved south this year. So I've on my yard just outside of Peterborough, I've had all the winter finches in the past couple weeks, with the exception of hoary redpoll. But I've probably seen hoary redpolls fly over. They just haven't stopped, so I haven't been able to know that's what they were. So in southern Ontario, you can be finding them anywhere this year, really. Redpolls, they really like weedy fields at this time of year. They're not really coming into feeders yet. And Ron Pittaway once explained to me that when we're in a situation like we're in right now, where we haven't really had redpolls come south for a few years, most of those redpolls probably have never seen a bird feeder in their life, because they've never been in southern Ontario. They're only a few years old. So in a year like this, when we haven't had redpolls in the south for a while, they don't really know about bird feeders yet, and it won't really be until the second half of the winter when they start to figure it out. So probably for the first half of the winter, you'll have to look for them in weedy fields or in alders and birch trees. They really like those. The crossbills, I've been hearing about crossbills feeding in spruce trees in particular. The pine grosbeaks drive around looking for fruit trees, so crab apples and mountain ash, things like that. And evening grosbeaks are mostly coming into feeders that have platform feeders with oil sunflower. But there's not really any concentration areas of finches right now. They're just sort of scattered across southern Ontario.
Yeah. Excellent. And we also have a question for looking for winter owls in Wellington County, and also somebody who wants to know the best way to find an owl in the Kitchener area. So those are kind of close. So.
Yeah, everybody loves owls, and maybe before I answer that, I kind of forgot in my presentation. If you're visiting Amherst Island, especially if you're going to the owl woods, there's some pretty important rules. You'd see them when you get there on the sign, but there's important rules to keep the owls safe. So I'll reiterate or tell people those rules now, so you're aware of them in case you are going to go. You're not allowed to bring dogs in there. You're not allowed to use flash photography, and you need to stay on the trails. That's kind of a given, but unfortunately, it needs to be said. And similarly, you should not be flushing owls. If you're within 10 or 20 feet of an owl, you're almost certainly too close. So stay as far away from them as you can. Stay on the trails. Don't use flash photography. Those are some of the rules when you're visiting the owl woods, and it's really important that people obey those. And more generally, when it comes to owls, because they can be vulnerable, especially the nocturnal owls that are roosting during the day, it's really important to give them their space, and watch for signs that they're stressed. And in general, those species, it's usually not a good idea to be blasting their locations out over the internet to everybody. Now, in terms of finding owls in Wellington and Kitchener, that was the question?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so, I mean, it really depends on the kind of owl. There's two resident species in those areas, great horned owl and eastern screech owl. And eastern screech owl in particular is very common in the sort of Guelph, Kitchener area and the rest of southwestern Ontario. Basically, anywhere where there's some bigger trees, you'll have screech owls. You have to find them. That's the trick. Some good ways to find roosting screech owls is focusing on cavities. They usually roost in cavities, especially on like cold, sunny days. If you can find a cavity that faces south, so it gets that nice sun, but it's a cold day, they'll stick their heads out in the middle of the day. It's tough. They're hard birds to find because they're meant to be camouflaged and meant to be hidden. The easier owls to find are the snowy owls, and there's a fair number of snowy owls in some years in those areas. Again, it really varies from year to year. Snowy owls, they prefer the biggest, most open fields. So don't focus on tiny fields. Find the biggest fields you can find. And then, like I was saying in the Amherst section, usually during the day, they're just sitting on the ground, so it can be really hard to see. If you go out in the last hour of daylight, then they'll be starting to become active, and they'll be a lot easier to see. So they'll fly up to telephone poles and tops of trees, and they become a lot easier to spot.
Yeah, I always find too that snowy owls, you're always thinking they're going to be this pure white thing that's going to stick out like a sore thumb. And that's usually the plastic bag in the field. But because there's a lot of times they're the younger birds, so they have a lot of black spotting on them. So they're a lot grayer looking from a distance than you would think they would be. I've always found that just around the fields north of Point Pelee is the bright white thing is always some sort of piping or plastic bag or some sort of leftover farm equipment. So that's one little thing I learned. My other tip for owls too is I know, especially later in the winter, you'll often see great horns sitting along the edges of woodlots right at sunset as they're just getting ready. It's when they're starting to get more territorial. So that's another thing to kind of keep your eyes open for is something silhouetted at the edge of a woodlot. And the great horns are nice because they usually have their tufts up so you can spot them pretty easily. Bonnie had a question. She was wondering where specifically on the north shore of Lake Erie are you speaking about for great birding?
I'm talking about the entire north shore of Lake Erie. It's the whole thing is awesome. I've birded, Haldeman County towards Niagara, like the east end. I've probably spent the most time around Long Point. But a fair bit in Elgin County, like near St. Thomas. And then, everybody knows Point Pelee, Essex County. Essex County is the hardest one because there's the least natural habitat left.
Yeah.
I really like sort of Elgin to Haldeman because it's got these little forested ravines that seem to attract birds. But down in Essex, it's more so about going to Point Pelee.
Yeah, and just from the Pelee perspective too, depending on the winter, the western side of the park can be completely iced over really fast. So our open water disappears often faster than other parts of the lake. So, in December, we can sometimes have hundreds of thousands of scaup and mergansers off the peninsula, but as soon as the lake freezes, they all push further down. So, but in terms of things like hermit thrushes and bluebirds and robins and yellow-rumped warblers and sparrows, the park is full of those in the winter. So you just have to find the right spots to go, and even in the coldest days in January, you'll sometimes get Carolina wrens singing too. So. All right. Are there any other burning questions out there before we wrap things up for the evening? Let's give it a couple seconds here. Oh, we have somebody asking about how do we think winter birding can be made less of a white experience and more inclusive?
Oh, that's an awesome question. I wish I knew the answer, but I think it starts with us listening to people from different backgrounds. It's like anything. I think that if you don't see yourself represented in a hobby or in an activity, then you're obviously going to be less likely to take it up. So I think as a birding community, we need to do a better job at listening to people from other communities, and really sharing the stories of people who are from other backgrounds. And I think that's a first step. It's a tiny step. And I would love to know how to diversify the birding community more, because it's a huge weakness of ours. I know.
Somebody wants to know, are there good places for cardinals?
Are there good places for cardinals? Yeah.
It's in my park.
Yeah. Basically, the further south you are in Ontario, the more cardinals there are. That's like a gross generalization, but if you're down on Lake Erie, you see flocks of cardinals. If you're in London, you see flocks of cardinals. If you're in Kitchener-Waterloo, you see small flocks of cardinals, usually mixed in with tree sparrows and juncos. If you're in Peterborough, you see 1s and 2s of cardinals. And if you go further north, you're lucky if you see a cardinal. So they're pretty common in urban areas with lots of dense cover. It's a funny one because it's a species we didn't have in Ontario, 150 years ago, and they've just been slowly but steadily moving north. And like if you go to Point Pelee, you will see a lot of cardinals, but you don't have to go all the way to Point Pelee to see cardinals. Like Toronto, Hamilton, all the cities sort of south of the Canadian Shield should have pretty good cardinal populations.
We have somebody who wants to know if the same owl often comes back to the same area every year. They were thinking of the famous northern hawk owl from last year.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, I mean, with a bird like that hawk owl, it's unlikely, but it's possible. It really depends on the species. Owls in general are pretty nomadic, especially the hawk owls and boreal owls and things like that. So they tend to move around just depending on where there's food, more so. So in some years they won't even come south at all. And so it's unlikely with that hawk owl, but it really depends on the species. Some groups of birds, they're really faithful from year to year, coming back to the exact same spot.
Yeah.
I know, I told the story about the red-shouldered hawk that spent the winter 10 minutes from my parents' house, and it came back every year for 11 winters. Yeah. So that was a pretty cool story like that. But a lot of your feeder birds are probably the same ones from year to year. But those nomadic species like the winter finches and the owls, probably not so much.
Yeah, I remember one of the snowy owls that they had tagged with Project Snow a few years ago came right back to exactly the same spot in the airport near, I think it was near Pittsburgh. So I think it just sometimes even just depends on the individual. All right, we've had somebody asking about evening grosbeaks and have come further south. Any idea exactly where? I don't know, maybe look at eBird. Would you say that, Mike? To get a sense?
Yeah, so the question is how far south have they gone?
Yeah, because we've had them at Pelee, so...
Oh, yeah, well, they've made it to Florida, so...
Yeah. So they're
definitely everywhere in Ontario. You have a chance at seeing... Everywhere in southern Ontario, you have a chance at seeing evening grosbeaks. But yeah, they've made it all the way to Florida, some individuals, so... Yeah. It's a pretty incredible year for them.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah. And I think what's going to be interesting, too, is we're probably going to see some coming back in the spring as well, which that'll be kind of nice. Like, I remember, because I'm so old, back in the days when we used to almost always have evening grosbeak in early May at Pelee that were migrating back. So I have somebody who's asking about attracting more birds to their feeders. They're using basic seed mixes with sunflower, etc., and they also have Niger and peanuts. They've got about 14 species so far and looking for recommendations of anything else they can put out to attract a wider variety.
Okay, yeah. I have my own feeder experience to draw from, but I'm by no means an expert on attracting birds. Probably as much as the food you're offering, it's probably just as important, the sort of habitat and other features on your yard where you have the feeders. If there needs to be some dense cover for the birds to feel safe and to attract them. You can try putting out a water source. There's heaters for bird baths to keep it warm and ice free in the winter. But the reality is, most birds that are coming into your feeder are relying on, for the most part, they're relying on natural food sources or other food sources, and your feeders are just one piece of their daily food intake. So there's only so much you can do, but you can optimize your yard by creating cover and offering natural food sources too. If you're playing the long game, plant fruit, trees and shrubs that are going to provide food for birds, like like different types of berries. But in terms of feeders, I mean, you really only need sunflower seeds, in my opinion. Pretty much everything will eat black oil sunflower seeds, and that's basically all I feed. I feed Niger seed and black oil sunflower, and throw in a little bit of mixed seed because I like to believe that the sparrows like it better, but it's probably just sunflower seeds that you really need.
Yeah, I fed exclusively black oil sunflower seeds for when I was still up in Sarnia, and I had great success with that. I'd occasionally put out suet as well, but I had just about everything that could have possibly come in was coming in for black oil. So we have a couple more questions about Amherst. Just some notes about that the Owl Woods is not open from late November to the second week in December to the public. And somebody was asking if late November is too early for Amherst.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's a good point. So the Owl Woods are partially privately owned, so we're allowed to visit them as birders because the owners allow us to, basically. So they do close from mid-November for 2 or 3 weeks. The Kingston Naturalist Club is really good about posting the dates that it's closed. If you can't find that, you can message OFO. We can get you that information. So if you're going to go in late November, you got to be aware that you won't be able to go into the Owl Woods. So that might impact your decision. It wouldn't be too early, things like saw-whets are probably there now. The saw-whets are still moving a little bit, but for the most part, their big migration window is in October in Ontario. So the snowies are just starting to arrive, but things like short-eared owls are already there, and the snowies will just increase. I'd say the most popular time of year to go to Amherst is usually in January and sort of early February. But you could. As I said, I think Amherst is an awesome birding spot all year round, and you can get owls, starting in October, basically, in the Owl Woods.
And we have just one other person asking about the ferry and accommodations. So there's no accommodations on the island. You'd be day tripping to Amherst, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And the ferry does run through the winter.
Yeah, it's pretty fun to take the ferry. In the winter, they keep the channel open that the ferry runs back and forth, and it can be really good watching for snowy owls and sometimes short-eared owls sitting on the ice when you're going back and forth. And I think it was the winter of 2000 and 2001. There was an ivory gull that people were seeing along the ferry route, and people were riding the ferry just back and forth to see this ivory gull. There's been gyrfalcons seen taking the ferry, so it's like I said, it adds a real cool element to birding on the island.
Yeah,
and it's only about a 20-minute ride, so it's not like it eats up a whole part of your day.
Yes, somebody has said that the tufted titmouse is their nemesis bird, and they were wondering what kind of habitat do I look for in Niagara to see them.
So Niagara is a really good place to see tufted titmouse. If you can go online and listen to their calls and their song, that'll help you locate them. But they're usually with flocks of chickadees, and they're in pretty much every wooded type of habitat. So especially areas with lots of big oak trees, which there's a lot of along the banks of the Niagara River, there should be titmouse. The Dufferin Islands little park just above the falls is a traditional spot that people see tufted titmouse, and you can even get them to come feed out of your hand sometimes. But any wooded area along the river, you should have a shot at titmouse. Just keep an ear out for them and chickadees.
All right. And somebody is saying that they see a lot of hawks perched in trees along Highway 115 south of Peterborough. Are they usually red-tailed or rough-legged hawks?
Yeah, along the 115, it's mostly red-tailed hawks. In Peterborough, this is something that is really surprising to me because I grew up near Waterloo, where rough-legged hawks, you could go and see 10 or 20 in a day, no problem. And I thought that was normal for southern Ontario, but as it turns out, it's not. And I just happened to grow up in one of the best places to see rough-legged hawks in the world. In Peterborough, rough-legged hawk is quite rare. You usually can find one or two in spring and fall migration, but it's uncommon for us to have any here in the winter.
Yeah. We had somebody who's asked a question, do we have any tips about birding from the car? Where and how to search while staying comfortable and staying safe.
Yeah. Birding by car is a pleasant way to be birding in the winter. One of the tips I got from Brandon Holden. If you're out on a cold day and you open your window, you try to use your binoculars, you'll sometimes get like heat shimmer, and it makes it really hard to look through binoculars. Everything's blurry. And Brandon taught me that if you open the window on the opposite side of the car too, it sort of forces the cold air all through the car. It'll cool you down for a few minutes, but it clears up that heat shimmer. So that's a little trick that I've picked up. I do lots of birding by car. It depends what you're looking for. If I'm out looking for hawks, it's just driving slow, paying attention to where you're going is always important, and keep an eye out for the traffic around you. But you build up a search image basically. So like if you're looking for hawks, then you're searching at like the tops of trees and along the edges of woodlots. And if you're looking for snowy owls, then you're sort of scanning every fence post and every little sort of bump in the ground.
Yeah.
But it really just depends what you're looking for in terms of figuring out the search image and the places you want to focus.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time in the Sarnia area birding from car around Sarnia Bay and down the St. Clair River. So that was a lot of gull watching and duck looking at. And so we used the same trick as Brandon. We always had 2 car windows open, and you were bundled up to the nines, but you got to see a lot of cool stuff. One of the other things that we had, and it only works if you have like a flush mount scope. If you have an angled scope, it's not as effective. But we actually had a window mount for our telescope that we would just screw right onto the window, so you'd have the scope right there. And we always used to make fun of the guys from Michigan who'd come over and stand in gale force winds at the lighthouse with their scopes on tripods, and we'd just be in the car with the scope on tripod on the window and much warmer than they were. So we have one last question, and somebody's just asking, are there any good places in Peterborough in the winter?
Any good places in Peterborough? Yeah, there's plenty. As long as there's open water at Little Lake, there's usually some ducks, and once in a while there's something interesting mixed in. In a year when the finches aren't coming south, it's really worthwhile to drive up to petroglyphs and get onto the Canadian Shield. So like last winter when the finches stayed north, you could go up to petroglyphs and get like red crossbill and evening grosbeak and things like that weren't coming south. But you don't need to do that this year for finches. But you can go, if you get up onto the Shield at a place like petroglyphs, you have a chance at like blackback woodpecker. That's sort of the southern edge of as far as they get. Anywhere along the river. I really like just driving the river from Peterborough up towards Lakefield and watching for ducks, and then cruising back roads looking for things like Bohemian waxwings and hawks and owls.
All right. Well, I think we've got to everyone's questions. If somehow we missed a question, please send us a note and we'll get it answered for you. I want to thank you, Mike, for taking your time tonight to join us and talk about winter birding in Ontario. And I just want to remind everyone that the details for the Winter Birding Challenge are coming soon. So you can get excited. We'll be starting the challenge on December the 1st. So you got a couple weeks to get out there and get all your ID practice in so you can start counting on December 1st. There's going to be some great prizes again with this birding challenge, and we're looking forward to hearing about all your winter birding adventures. So thank you everyone for coming out this evening. We really appreciate it. We always get questions. We will be keeping this up on our Facebook page, so if anybody wants to go back and watch any parts of the video again, you can do that. And if for some reason you know someone who can't get on and watch it on Facebook, we will be posting this over onto YouTube tomorrow as well. So thank you so much, and have a great night, everybody. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. See you, everybody. Thanks.